Yes, as I was saying, the boys' feet were very, very sore from pressing on the pedals without shoes. And their hands and their fingers were tired and also sore. Everything in their body hurt. They had slept in the park the night before. Everything was taken from them. Their food was horrid. And now on top of it they suddenly realized, because they were so hungry they hadn't noticed, that the dining room, so-called dining room, smelled terrible. It smelled like 150 people who were in there hadn't bathed for weeks or maybe months. It smelled of sweat. It smelled of fart. I won't tell you some of the other smells because you might have to eat again in the next few days. But they suddenly realized that it smelled terrible. Oh, they were so tired though, so tired. All they wanted to do is go to sleep. That's all they wanted, was to go to sleep. Well, the little evil man came in, the little fat man, and walked up to everybody and said, "All right, everybody, you're probably tired and you want to go to sleep. Well, good news, it's bedtime." And the lights went out. The lights went out, and it was as dark could be. I mean, dark. You could wave your hand in front of your eyes, and you wouldn't see a thing, because there was no light. There were no windows. In fact, there was very little air. Up at the top, near the ceiling, there were slits in the wall, and behind the slits there were boards that blocked any light that might come in, although a little bit of air could come around the boards into the slits. It wasn't much, and it was that hot, humid air that they had slept in the night before. Between the smells and the air, you'd think that they wouldn't be able to sleep at all, but they were really tired. So the next question was, where were they supposed to sleep? Well, it didn't take long for them to realize that the place to sleep was on the benches and on the tables. The benches were maybe this wide, not as wide as their back, and the benches were a little wider, wide enough so that each of them could have a plate in front of them and another plate on the other side of the table for the other person opposite them. A metal plate was brought in with a little piece of stale bread and that disgusting water, and that was it. So they realized that that was where they had to sleep. Of course, they could only feel it. They couldn't see it. The plates had been taken away by the big, ugly, hairy, smelly men, who, when they picked up the plates, shoved the boys and everyone else out of their way to get them. They didn't reach in like decent human beings. No, these guys were like, I won't say like animals, because I don't want to insult animals. Well, it was very difficult, very difficult. The boys decided to do the table, and it was wide enough so roughly 3 people crammed next to each other could possibly get onto it, because there was no choice. There was no choice. The places that were available between the benches and the tables just allowed one length of person on a bench, 3 people crammed together on a table, and you had your feet on someone's head and someone else's feet on your head, and the boys were back to back, and next to somebody else, which fortunately for them was a very thin, quiet lady, because had it been one of the fatter men, or women in the group, they would have probably been knocked off, and then they would have landed on the person lying on the bench below them, because the benches were fixed. They couldn't move. They were fixed to the ground, as were the tables. Everything, in fact, was locked down. Well, they were, in fact, so tired that they fell asleep. And they slept for maybe 2.5 hours, when suddenly Dov woke up, and Yehudah immediately, of course, woke up too, because Dov made a sound like because the smell in the room had gotten worse. It seemed like everyone was, having an upset stomach or something. I won't tell you the details. I don't want to upset you. But it was like really, really horrible. And they really could hardly sleep for the rest of the night. They just sort of struggled. And in fact, they decided to get off the table, climb around the bench without stepping on anyone's head, and lie down on the floor. That seemed like a good idea. Why not lie down on the floor? Well, that didn't last too long, because as soon as they got down on the floor, they realized there were all kinds of bugs and mice and possibly rats running around, and they would have been on the tables and the benches too, but there was no room for them, and as soon as anything got up, somebody would knock it off, even in their sleep. So they got back on the table. Fortunately, their spaces were still there, because the person next to them was not so big. And then they fell asleep. Well, the way they knew it was time to get up is suddenly the lights were put on. And these were like really bright lights. I mean, really bright lights. And they flashed on, and the boys woke up immediately, because now it was time for so-called breakfast. Breakfast. The word breakfast comes from break fast. Fast is what you do on Yom Kippur, and break is to stop. In America, at the end of Yom Kippur, people have friends over for a break fast. So breakfast is really to break your fast. Well, in this case, it was appropriate, because they didn't have anything to eat the night before to talk about, so they might just as well have been fasting. Well, in the morning, there was something decent to eat, but nothing like me and Grandma had this morning, if I may take a quick aside. I said to Grandma this morning, "Naomi, how about pancakes this morning? I mean, we never have pancakes except when you guys are here. But I wanted to have pancakes because I wanted to try out the maple syrup that we made. We haven't tasted it yet." So Grandma made a big, big stack of pancakes, and I took them hot off the griddle, and I put some hot maple syrup on them, and it was very, very good. Very, very tasty, I must say. But back to the story, because these boys would not be getting any kind of decent breakfast like we had. No, not at all. They were going to have, well, the lady came up and said, "Good morning, everyone. Good morning, boys. It's time for breakfast. Now here you can have your breakfast." And she put down a metal plate with a little piece of stale bread and a little cup of disgusting water and a tiny little cup of yogurt, like Lebanon. Well, it would have been better if it had been a little fresher, because there was some green mold floating around on the top. And the boys were almost hungry enough to eat the mold, but not quite that hungry. So they left the mold and ate the yogurt. And they were pretty, well, it was something at least. It was something. And then the plates were taken away, and the big, ugly, hairy guys came in and marched them up to the shop, up the stairs to the next floor, and into the room where they were to be locked to the machines. Well, a couple of the people there decided they didn't want to work anymore. So they ran away, and they started running around the shop looking for a door. But the only door was the door down to the so-called dining room, which could be called the smell room, for all I care. The door that